Morning, Bulldogs. Happy Friday. Um, it is National Lost Dog Awareness Day. So one thing I like to do, that I'm trained to do is on the weekends I go to the Franklin County Dog Shelter and volunteer and walk dogs and hang out with them so that they can get out of the kennel because they're lonely in those cages because they've been lost or given up. So today we are going to be able to explain factors leading to the breakdown of medieval society, specifically the Black Death. All right, the Black Death. Imagine you woke up one day and you had huge boils the size of golf balls on your neck and in your armpits and in where your lymph nodes are, and you were coughing up blood, which was basically your lungs liquefied, and then you died within a matter of days. So we are going to be talking about that because you can't have a society if half the people in the society are dead. So we're going to talk about how that led to the breakdown of medieval society. And we've got our normal do now notes, guided practice, independent practice. Lesson's a little bit longer, but really interesting with all the facts about the bubonic plague and how it worked and how it really affected society. People needed someone to blame. All right, so go ahead and let's get started with our do now. All right, so our do now is we have a map, newcomers in the Roman world, AD 526. You're going to, sorry, my eyes are watering. You're going to look and analyze the map, look at all those lines, look at all the labels, and you're going to determine which of the four options at the bottom of your screen are accurate, which conclusion can be drawn from the map. So go ahead and pause your video and answer that question. Sorry, my hair is like bothering me. Just do that for now. I'm not sure that's much better. All right. So our answer is C. The eastern region was unified under the Byzantine Empire. And how I know this from a viewer or an analyzer of the map is that if you look on the left, now your initial gut might say, okay, Rome was the capital of the entire Western region. We know that that's where the Pope was and the Vatican, and we're thinking Christianity here. Well, you want to take the church out of it, and you want to specifically think about kingdoms. If you look on the west side, there's tons of kingdoms. All these kingdoms, Vandal Kingdom, Frankish Kingdom, Burgundian Kingdom, all of these kingdoms. Whereas I go to the East region where it says the Byzantine Empire, and it's just one group. There's not a ton of little kingdoms. There's not tons of little regions. See how these are all shaded differently because they belong to different people. This all belong to the same group. So that means that number 3, the eastern region was unified under the Byzantine Empire would be accurate. And with your knowledge of history from yesterday's lesson, you know that through the 100 Years' War, the English and the French were constantly fighting, which is the opposite of unified. So you want to make sure that you are definitely taking those things into consideration when you are comparing the two sides. And that's really all you're doing for this question is comparing this side of the map to this side of the map. All right, so some notes today. We have first, and the first word and the second word are basically the same thing, but the first word is like the nickname for the bubonic plague. It's the epidemic of the bubonic plague, which is the Black Death. And my context clue sentence today is, due to the Black Death, 1 out of every 2 people in Europe died. Bubonic plague is the devastating global epidemic that struck Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s. Many plague historians blame the spread of the bubonic plague on trade along the English road. And the Peasants' Revolt was in 1381. English peasants revolt against lords and manors. English peasants were upset and led the Peasants' Revolt in response to lords' control over wages, which you'll read more about. Essentially, the lords were, because everyone was dying, the lords weren't making as much money, so they weren't paying peasants as much as they were, and the peasants revolt and said, you know, you got to pay me a living wage here, no matter what. And so they flip it out on their lords. Right here, if you want, and I highly recommend it, this is a video, history.com, Black Death. It's only about 4 minutes long, but it's really, really informative and really interesting explanation of the 2 forms of the bubonic plague, the pneumonic and then I can't remember the name of the other one, but the pneumonic is like pneumonia, where essentially your lungs liquefy and you cough them up and you die. And then the other one is basically you start just bleeding from everywhere. So gross. But he explains it, the scientist does really, really well. I think actually the doctor too. Um, it is history.com, so if you are in the penalty box, you should be able to access it. If you can't, it's not the end of the world. Again, it's only 4 minutes long, and it just talks about the two forms of the plague. If you want to find out more about that, I can try and do a workaround so that I can find that clip for you in a way that is accessible. Let me click it now and see if we can. It should be okay because it's history.com. It's not like YouTube or anything random. Let's get this ad out. See if we can. Here we go. So that's just a preview of that film. Again, it's oh geez, look at me and my technical issues. Again, it's only about 4 minutes long. He goes into a little bit more detail about those two forms of the plague that you can get. Okay, but again, if you don't have access to it because you're in penalty box, let me know and I can try and figure out a workaround with Mr. Flynn. This is just a great graphic. I love this graphic. I've used it for years, kind of explaining the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century. And that you can see that with all the different towns, it has a year next to it. So that would be the year the plague reached it. And you see the plague, this, evil Grim Reaper kind of working his way to the west to get into the different towns. Now, some places were spared. Warsaw, for example, that's in Poland today, was spared, and that's probably because there wasn't a lot of it wasn't as greatly populated, so it didn't really go there. It was concentrated more in these really big, bustling cities. And then we have our Black Death doctor, and this would be the outfit that if a doctor visited your house when you were sick that they would wear. So creepy, huh? But that's what they wore, and I can explain more of that. Then we're going to practice some map skills really quick. So we have another map that's showing us the spread of the Black Death. We have our key, and we have our lovely rats helping us guide the questions. So we're going to look at question 1 and 2, which areas of Europe were first affected by the plague, and then from which direction did the plague travel across Europe? So you can go ahead and pause the video and answer questions 1 and 2 in the box. Use the key. All right, so number 1, which areas of Europe were first affected by the plague? We have areas near the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So we see here, Black Sea earliest was in 1346, that darkest brown. And we see a deeper brown here by the and also deep around here by the Mediterranean Sea, which would mean areas of this region started getting the plague around 1347, 1348. So it started near there. And it traveled from east to west and from south to north. Okay. All right, guided practice. In 1347, 10 years after the start of the Hundred Years' War, Europe was struck by a terrible epidemic, a disease that spreads quickly through a population. The epidemic was the bubonic plague, a deadly infection. Victims usually died within a few days, often in terrible agony, with their bodies covered in buboes or swellings. At the time, people called the epidemic the Great Dying. Much later, it came to be known as the Black Death. No one knew what caused it. It may have been carried by infected fleas that lived on rats. However, one form of the plague was transferred through the air and inhaled. So it did become airborne. The epidemic began in Central Asia. From there, it slowly spread along the trade networks that linked China, India, and the Middle East. Before reaching Europe, the Black Death had killed millions in Asia. People infected with the plague rode merchant ships from east to ports throughout Europe. The disease swept towards southern Europe from ports on the Black Sea such as Jaffa. First Italy, and then France, Spain, and England were struck. Travelers carried the plague up rivers and on overland trade routes, deep into the heart of Europe. In the decades that followed, the plague would often seem to ease before returning with terrifying force. So we see this ebb and flow. And if you kind of think about it, it's very similar to coronavirus, right? Like we kind of see this huge influx of people getting sick, people getting corona, and then it kind of like slows down and eases off for a little bit. We saw that when a lot of people started getting their vaccines. But now Columbus is back at a level 4. We're starting to see another growth in cases again. So we see this growth and then it backs off a little bit and grows again and backs off. And the same thing happens with the plague. So you're going to go ahead and pause the video and answer the questions. How did the plague reach interior areas or the inside of Europe, the heart of Europe? And then what part did trade networks play in the spread of plague from China to Europe? So think about trade networks. All right, so for number 1, I have people carrying the infection traveled up rivers and along inland trade routes to the interior. And then for number 2, I have people carried the plague along the trade routes that linked the east and the west. Okay, so those trade routes linked it, and that's what caused the plague to spread from China to Europe. So I'm going to pause that and get that down before we move on to our written response. Pause if you need to. All right, so our written response is building off of what we just answered. How did the Black Death begin to spread through Europe? So we're basically taking what we just read, both parts of it, and elaborating just a little bit, and also kind of just, well, I wouldn't say elaborating, but like summing it up, but having backed up information with our claim, our quote, and our reasoning, which we did the other day using CER, which you use in science all the time. So go ahead and pause the video, answer here. You want to answer the question, tell me how the Black Death began to spread, provide evidence from the text, so that would be a quote, and then give me the reasoning that supports that claim. Okay, so go ahead and pause, and we'll come back for the version or a version that would be considered appropriate and for full credit. All right, so written response. In my red, I have my claim. I know these might be different colors than Miss Dawson or Mrs. Dawson. We have blue, quote, and purple reasoning. The Black Death spread throughout Europe through trade. Answered the question. People infected with the plague rode merchant ships from east to ports throughout Europe. There's my quote. As traders and merchants continued to travel and come into contact with each other, the disease spread rapidly. That's my reasoning. That explains why that quote supports my answer. So trade, merchant ships, and then explaining that is supporting my claim that they went through trade. So pause if you need to get that. Then you're going to move on to independent practice. You've got one question here that has to do with the text, and then you need to use the chart for number 5. You have the Peasants' Revolt, and then you have one more written response. In what ways did the plague help bring about the end of the Age of Faith? Okay, remember this time period was called the Age of Faith because the church was very influential and important. and it had to do a lot with the growth of religion and learning. So how would the plague help end that time period? How would the plague help end that age of faith and learning? Okay, so you're going to answer here using CER. Then you have 5 multiple choice questions quickly. You're going to see these questions again next week, so I highly encourage you to try your best on these and go back to the text. They're all in the text from yesterday and today. And then you are done. And then I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And next week's going to look a little bit different, again, because we have math state testing. So it's not going to be quite as, it's going to be similar to last week where you had a lot of practice with skills rather than slides, except for Monday and Friday. So anyways, have a great weekend, and I will see you all next week. Bye.